Hello General Biology and welcome to screencast number 4. We're section 3.4 in our chapter 3 ecology series. And we were talking about the nitrogen cycle, and the nitrogen cycle, as I said, is a little bit more complex than the other cycles that we were talking about. And I'm just going to run back to this picture so we can do a quick review in case you left off and you came back at a later time and had forgotten things. So when we take a look at nitrogen, nitrogen makes up about 78% of the atmospheric gas, and in the form of N2 we cannot consume it and the plants can't consume it, so it has to be converted. And the way it's going to be converted is through bacteria that is called nitrogen fixing bacteria that can either be found at the roots of legumes like bean plants, or it can be found in just the soil. And what that is going to do in some ways is it's going to take that nitrogen, and from the hydrogen that you get from decomposition, it's going to join the nitrogen and hydrogen together and become ammonia. And now as ammonia, there's other types of bacteria that exist in the soil called nitrifying bacteria that's able to take that ammonia and now break it down and add oxygen to the nitrogen. And if it gets 2 oxygen atoms, then it's called a nitrite, and if it gets 3 oxygen atoms, it's called a nitrate. So now in this form, this can be picked up by the plants and used in the plants, and then the animals can eat the plants. So this whole process where the nitrogen is fixing it, that's called nitrogen fixation. Now some of the nitrogen has to be converted back into atmospheric nitrogen, and that happens through the process of denitrifying. And denitrifying again happens with bacteria, where it pulls the oxygens off of the nitrates and the nitrites, and it puts the nitrogen back into the atmosphere. Okay, so that's what we were talking about. The last thing that we needed to say on this is that those decomposers that we saw are also going to release the nitrogen from waste products, from dead organisms, and the ammonia that is produced from this process and the nitrates and the nitrites are going to be picked up by the producers again so that they can be eaten by the consumers. So when we break that apart, when we break that nitrogen apart from the nitrates and we turn it back into nitrogen gas, that process is going to be called denitrification. Okay, so that's what we had mentioned before. Humans in their activity are going to add nitrogen to the atmosphere as well, because we manufacture synthetic fertilizers and we use nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium in those fertilizers. So we put those fertilizers down on our fields and our lawns because we want green lawns. And what happens is they can actually get carried to the surface water or the groundwater by precipitation and get into our water systems. It's been responsible for algae blooms in ponds and lakes because of the runoff and the fertilizer getting into those systems. So nitrogen has that atmospheric stage, carbon has that atmospheric stage, but phosphorus does not, because phosphorus is a mineral. It is important as well in DNA and RNA. It's also important in that ATP molecule because this is a triphosphate, so we need phosphate in there. So that's significant. And phosphorus is very important, but there's no atmospheric stage, so it all stays within the soil and the sediments. So phosphorus is inorganic phosphate, and it remains mostly on the land, mostly in the rock, and within the soil and the minerals, and as dissolved phosphate in the ocean and as phosphate sediments. So that's where the soil is the phosphates are going to be found: soil, rock, and dissolved phosphates. And what happens with this, and we're going to look at this illustration, I like this one, is that the phosphorus is going to be picked up by the root system of our plants or by the plants in our aquatic ecosystems. And then the animals are going to eat the plants. And then when they die or when they relieve themselves, it's going to go back down into the soil again. So there's no atmospheric state for this because it does not turn into a gas, because it's a mineral. It's an inorganic mineral. Okay? So as rocks and sediments wear down, phosphate is going to be released. Some of the phosphate's going to stay in the land and cycles between the organisms in the soil. Plants are going to bind phosphate into organic compounds when they absorb it from the soil or from water. The organic phosphate is going to move through the food web from the producers to the consumers and then to the rest of the ecosystem. Phosphate is also going to wash into rivers and streams, where it will also dissolve, and it will eventually make its way to the ocean, where marine organisms can then process and incorporate the phosphorus into their biological compounds for their life processes. So now that we've gotten that under our belt, we're going to talk about nutrient limitation. And we're going to see what happens when the change in the availability of the nutrient happens and how it affects primary productivity of an ecosystem. We're going to take into consideration, that abundant supply of sunlight and water that are available, and what that primary productivity has with the ecosystem when there's things that are limited by their availability in their nutrients. So ecologists often are interested in an ecosystem's primary productivity. And primary productivity is the rate in which primary producers can create their organic material. How quickly can they be productive? So those producers, those plants, how productive are they? If they don't have an essential nutrient, if it's in short supply, they're not receiving it, then the hypothesis is their primary productivity would be limited. So let's think about this. Have you ever heard of the disease or the disorder osteoporosis? Probably. Osteoporosis is brittle bones, and it happens a lot in women because when we have babies, babies steal calcium from our bones during the development, and older women going through menopause, if they don't get enough calcium in their diets, they tend to have brittle bones, and it causes them to hunch over and not be able to stand up that straight, and it's called osteoporosis. So the limiting nutrient in this case is calcium. When you take the calcium out of the diet, or you cause it to be limited, it creates the bones to be brittle. So with this in mind, ecologists said that if the plants don't get a nutrient they need, then their productivity is going to be limited. And we call this, when it limits that productivity, we call it a limiting nutrient. Okay, when it affects that. So if the growth of a crop plant is typically limited by one or more nutrients, that must be taken up by the plants through the roots. We add fertilizers, and fertilizers contain a large amount of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, and we add that limiting nutrient to the soil to help the plants grow better. Carbon is not included in chemical fertilizers because the plants acquire the carbon dioxide so much in the atmosphere, so that's one thing that is abundant. It's not going to be limited. But other micronutrients like calcium and magnesium and sulfur and iron and even manganese, they are necessary in relatively small amounts, and they will sometimes be included in specialty fertilizers in order to help the plants to grow. So this is one way that we can replace worn out used soil and put new nutrients in by fertilizing it. All nutrient cycles are going to work together like the gears that we see here. If there is a nutrient that is in short supply, then any of these wheels are going to stick. They're not going to be able to go, and it's going to stop and slow the whole process down altogether. So it's essential to have the nutrients within the soil. Oceans typically are nutrient poor compared to many of the land areas because when you think of something dying, it's going to settle really, really deep down in the ocean, and it's not always going to be able to be obtained. In the ocean and other saltwater environments, nitrogen is often the limiting nutrient. The nitrogen levels are typically really, really low. In streams and lakes and freshwater environments, phosphorus is typically the limiting nutrient because it can wash down the flowing streams with that, and it can have an effect on the productivity of the plant life in that area. Sometimes an aquatic ecosystem can receive a large input of a limiting nutrient, like I said, from runoff on fertilizers, and it'll cause what is known as an algal bloom, where algae that's typically starving and unable to grow because it doesn't have the nutrients, now going to get the excess nutrients, and it's going to suddenly just grow, and that can create problems within the balance of that ecosystem. The result of this runoff, as I said, is an algal bloom, and you get a dramatic increase in the amount of algae and other primary producers due to this increase. And if there aren't enough consumers that eat the algae, so not enough herbivores that eat the algae, then the bloom can actually cover the surface of the water and really disrupt the functioning of the ecosystem. It can put in too much oxygen and not enough carbon dioxide, and then the fish will start to die because literally they suffocate from too much oxygen. And then when they die, decomposition puts more nutrients in for the algae to grow and to benefit. And that, again, it's like just this whole evil domino effect that goes on. All right, that's the end of the chapter, and that means you're going to have a test. We'll be doing some activities in class to hopefully reinforce this and going over some of those cycles. See you in the next chapter.